Old Yeller. Chapter 1. We called him Old Yeller. The name had sort of a double meaning. One part meant that his short hair was a dingy yellow, a color that we called yeller in those days. The other meant that when he opened his head, the sound he let out came closer to being a yell than a bark. I remember like yesterday how he strayed in out of nowhere to our log cabin on Birdsong Creek. He made me so mad at first that I wanted to kill him, and then later, when I had to kill him, it was like having to shoot one of my own folks. And that's how much I'd come to think of that big yeller dog. He came in the late 1860s, the best that I can remember. Anyway, it was the year that Pa and a bunch of the other Salt Lick settlers formed a pool herd of their little separate bunches of steers and then trailed them to the new cattle market at Abilene, Kansas. This was to get cash money, a thing that all Texans were short of in those days right after the Civil War. We lived then in a new country, and a good one. As Pa pointed out the day the men talked over making the drive, we had plenty of grass, wood, and water. We had wild game for killing, fertile ground for growing bread corn, and the Indians had been put on the reservations with the return of the U.S. soldiers to the Texas forts. In fact, Pa wound up, all we lack of having a tight tailholt on the world is a little cash money, and we can get that at Abilene. Well, the idea sounded good, but some of the men still hesitated. Abilene was better than 600 miles north of the Texas hill country that we lived in. It would take months for the men to make the drive and ride back home. And all the time the women folk and the children of Salt Licks would be left in a wild frontier settlement to make out the best that they could. Still, they needed money, and they realized that whatever a man does, he's bound to take some risks. So they talked it over with each other and with their women and decided it was the thing to do. They told their folks what to do in case the Indians come off the reservations, or if the coons got to eating the corn, or the bears got to killing too many hogs. Then they gathered their cattle, burned a trail brand on their hips, and pulled out on the long trail to Kansas. I remember how it was the day that Pa left. I remember him standing in front of the cabin with his horse saddled, his gun in his scabbard, and his bedroll tied on back of the Kent. I remember how tall and straight and handsome he looked, with his high-crowned hat and his black mustache drooping in cow-horn curves past the corner of his mouth. And I remember how Ma was trying to keep from crying because he was leaving, and how little Arliss, who was only 5 and didn't know much, wasn't trying to keep from crying at all. In fact, he was howling his head off. Not because Pa was leaving, but because he couldn't go as too. I wasn't about to cry. I was about 14 years old, pretty near a grown man. I stood back, and I didn't let on for a minute that I wanted to cry. Pa got through loving up Ma and little Arliss and mounted his horse. I looked up at him. He motioned for me to come along. So I walked beside his horse down the trail that led under the big live oaks and past the spring. When he had gotten out of hearing of the house, Pa reached down and put a hand on my shoulder. "Now, Travis," he said, "you're getting to be a big boy, and while I'm gone, you'll need to be the man of the family. I want you to act like one. You take care of Ma and little Arliss, and you look after the work, and don't wait around for your ma to have to point it out what needs to be done. You think you can do that?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Now there's the cows to milk, and wood to cut, and young pigs to mark, and fresh meat to shoot. But mainly there's the corn patch. If you don't work it right, or if you let the vermins eat up the roasting ears, we'll be without bread corn for the winter." "Yes, sir," I said. All right, boy. I'll be seeing you this fall. I stood there and let him ride on. There wasn't any more to say. Suddenly I remembered, went running down the trail after him, calling for him to wait. He pulled up his horse and twisted around in the saddle. Yeah, boy, what is it? That horse, I said. What horse? He said, like he had never heard me mention it before. You mean you're wanting a horse? Now, Pa, I complained, you know I've been aching all over for a horse to ride. I've told you time and time again. I looked up to catch him grinning at me and felt foolish that I didn't realize he was teasing me. What you're needing worse than a horse is a good dog. Yes, sir, but a horse is what I'm wanting the worst, though. All right, he said. You act a man's part while I'm gone, and I'll see that you get a man's horse to ride when I sell the cattle. I think we can shake on that deal. He reached out his hand, and we shook. It was the first time I'd ever shaken hands like a man. It made me feel big and solemn and important in a way that I'd never felt before. I knew then that I could handle whatever needed being done while Pa was gone. I turned and started back up the trail toward the cabin. I guess maybe Pa was right. I guessed I could use a dog. All the other settlers had dogs. They were big, fierce cur dogs that the settlers used for catching hogs or driving cattle and fighting coons out of the cornfields. They kept them as watchdogs against the depredation of the lofer wolves, bears, and panthers and raiding Indians. There is no question about it. For the sort of country we lived in, a good dog around the place was worth sometimes more than 2 or 3 men. I knew this as well as anybody, because the summer before I had had a good dog. His name was Bell. He was nearly as old as I was. We had had him ever since I could remember. He had protected me from rattlesnakes and bad hogs while I was little. He'd hunt with me when I was bigger, and once he had dragged me out of Birdsong Creek when I was about to drown, and another time he had given warning in time to keep some raiding Comanches from stealing and eating our mule Jumper. And then he had to go act a fool and get himself killed. It was while Pa and I were cutting wild hay in a little patch of prairie back of the house. A big diamondback rattler struck at Pa, and Pa chopped his head off with one quick lick of his scythe. The head just dropped to the ground 3 or 4 feet away from the writhing body. It lay there with the ugly mouth opening and shutting, still trying to bite something. Well, as smart as Bell was, you'd have thought he had better sense than to go up and nuzzle that rattler's head, but he didn't, and a second later he was falling back, howling and slinging his own head till his ears popped, but it was too late then. That snake's mouth had snapped shut on his nose, driving the fangs in so deep that it was a full minute before he could sling the bloody head loose. He died that night, and I cried for a week. Pa tried to make me feel better by promising to get me another dog right away, but I wouldn't have it. It made me mad just to think about some other dog trying to take Bell's place. And I still felt the same way about it. All I wanted now was a horse. The trail I followed led along the bank of Birdsong Creek, through some bee myrtle brush. The bush was bloomin' white and smelled sweet. In the top of one a mockingbird was singing, and that made me recollect how Birdsong Creek had gotten its name. Maud named it when she and Pa came to settle. Ma told me about it. She said that she named it the first day that she and Pa got there, with Ma driving the oxen cart loaded with our house plunder, and with Pa driving the cows and the horses. They had meant to build closer to the other settlers over on Salt Branch, but they had camped there at the spring, and the bee myrtle had been bloomin' white that day, and it seems like every bush there was a mockingbird singing his fool head off. It was all so pretty and smelled so good, and the singing birds made such fine music that Ma just wouldn't go on. "We'll build right here," she had told Pa, and that's what they had done. Built themselves a home right there on Birdsong Creek, and fought off the Indians, and cleared a corn patch, and raised me and little Arliss, and lost a little sister who died of a fever. Now it was my home too, and while Pa was gone, it was up to me to look after it. I came to our spring that was gushing clear cold water out of a split in a rock ledge, and the water poured into a little pothole about the size of a wagon bed, and in that pothole, up to his ears in the water, stood little Arliss, right in our drinking water. So I says, "Arliss, you get out of that water." Well, Arliss, he just turned and stuck out his tongue at me. "I'll cut me a sprout," I warned. All he did was stick out his tongue at me again and splash water in my direction. So I fetched out my knife and I cut a green mesquite sprout, trimmed off all the leaves and thorns off, and then I headed for him. Well, Arliss then saw that I meant business, and he come lunging out of that pool, knocking water all over his clothes laying on the bank. And he lit out for the house, running naked and screaming bloody murder. To listen to him, you'd have think the Comanches were lifting his scalp. Well, Ma heard him and came rushing out of the cabin, and she saw little Arliss running naked. She saw me following him with a mesquite stick in one hand and his clothes in the other hand, and, well, she called out to me. "Travis," she said, "what on earth have you done to your little brother?" Well, I said, "Nothing yet, but if he don't keep out of our drinking water, I'm going to wear him to a frazzle." Well, that's what Pa always told little Arliss when he caught him in the pool, and I figured if I had to take Pa's place, well, I just might as well talk like him. Ma stared at me for a minute, and I thought she was fixing to argue that I was getting too big for my britches. Lots of times she'd tell me that, but this time she didn't. She just smiled suddenly and grabbed little Arliss by one ear and held on. He went to hollering and jumping up and down and trying to pull away, but she held on till I got there with his clothes, and she put them on him and told him, "Now look here, young squirrel, you better listen to your big brother Travis if you want to keep out of trouble." Then she made him go sit still a while in the dog run. The dog run was an open roofed space betwixt the two rooms of our log cabin. It was a good place to eat watermelons in the hot summer, or to sleep when the night breezes weren't strong enough to push through the cracks between the cabin logs. Sometimes we hung up fresh killed meat out there to cool down. Little Arliss sat in the dog run and sulked while I packed water from the spring. I packed the water in a bucket that Pa had made out of the hide of a cow's leg. I poured the water into the ash hopper that stood beside the cabin. That was so the water could trickle down through the wood ashes and become lye water, and then later Ma would mix that lye water with hog fat and boil it in an iron pot when she wanted to make some soap. When I went to cut wood for Ma, though, little Arliss left the dog run to come watch me work. Like always, he stood in exactly the right place for the chips from my axe to fly up and maybe knock his eyeballs out. I said, "You better skin out for that house, you little scamp." And he skinned out, too, just like I told him, without even sticking out his tongue at me this time. And he sat right there till Ma called us for dinner. After dinner, I didn't wait for Ma to tell me that I needed to finish running out the corn middles. I got right up from the table and went out and hooked Jumper to the double shovel. I started in plowing, where Pa had left off the day before. I figured that if I got an early start, I could finish the corn patch by sundown. Jumper was a dun mule with a narrow black strip running alongside his backbone between his mane and his tail. Pa had always called him Jumper because no one yet had ever built a fence that he couldn't jump over. Pa claimed Jumper could clear the moon if he took a notion just to see the other side of it. Jumper was a pretty good mule, though. He was gentle to ride, and you could pack a fresh meat on him, and he was willing about pulling a plow. Only sometimes when I plowed him, and he decided to quit when time would come, well, he would just stop working right then. Maybe we'd be out in the middle of the field when Jumper got the notion it was time for dinner, And right then he'd swing around and head for the cabin, dragging down corn with the plow and paying no mind whatever to my hauling back on the reins and hollering whoa. Late that evening, Jumper tried to pull that stunt on me again, but I was laying for him. With Pa gone, I knew I had to teach Jumper a good old lesson. I'd been plowing all afternoon, holding a green cedar club between the plow handles. I still lacked 3 or 4 corn rows before finishing when sundown would come, and Jumper decided it was quitting time. He let out a long bray and started wringing his tail, and he left the middle he was traveling in. Well, he struck out through the young corn, heading for the cabin, and I didn't even holler whoa at him. I just threw the looped reins over my shoulder and run right up beside him. Well, I drew back my green cedar club, and I whacked him so hard across the jawbone that I nearly dropped him in his tracks. Well, you never saw a worse surprised mule. He started to run, then just stood there and stared at me, like maybe he couldn't believe that I was man enough to give him a good clubbing that hard. Well, I drew back my club again, and I said, "Jumper, if you don't get back there and finish this here plowing job, you're going to get more of the same. Do you understand?" Well, I guess he understood all right. Anyhow, from then on, till we were through, he stayed right on the job. The only thing he did different from what he had been done with Pa was to travel with his head turned sideways, keeping an eye on every step of the way. When I finally got to the house, I found that Ma had done the milking, and she and little Arliss were waiting on supper for me. And just like we generally waited for Pa when he came in late, I crawled into bed with little Arliss that night, feeling pretty satisfied with myself. Our bed was a corn shuck mattress that laid over a couple squared up cowhides that had been laced together. The cowhides stood about 2 feet off the dirt floor, stretched tight inside a pole frame Pa had built in one corner of the room. I lay there, listening to the corn shucks squeak, when I breathed into the owls hooting in the timber along Birdsong Creek. I guessed I had made a good start. I had done my work without having been told, and I'd taught little Arliss and Jumper that I wasn't to be trifled with, and Ma could already see that I was man enough to wait supper on. Well, I guessed that I could handle things while Pa was gone just about as good as he could. End of chapter 1.